Jack. Hay un bote. Jack.
RMS Titanic was a British passenger liner, which was operated by the White Star Line. It sank in the North Atlantic Ocean on April 15, 1912. After striking an iceberg during its maiden voyage from Southampton, England, to New York City. This disaster remains the deadliest peacetime sinking of an ocean liner or cruise ship. The Titanic was the largest ship afloat at the time, and it was built by the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland. It was 882 feet and 9 inches long, with a maximum breadth of 92 feet and 6 inches. And it had 10 decks: the boat deck, which is where the lifeboats were housed; A deck, or the promenade deck, which contained first-class cabins, a smoking lounge, and writing rooms; B deck, or the bridge deck, which housed additional first-class cabins and accommodations; C deck, or the shelter deck, which is where crew members and the third-class public rooms were; D deck, or the saloon deck, which was dominated by 3 large public rooms, the first-class reception room, and the first-class and second-class dining saloons; E deck, or the upper deck, which was predominantly used for passenger accommodations for all 3 classes; F deck, or the middle deck, which mainly accommodated members of the second and third classes; G deck, or the lower deck, which was the lowest complete deck that carried passengers; and the orlop decks and tank top. The orlop decks were used as cargo spaces, and the tank top provided a platform for a lot of the ship's important parts like boilers, engines, turbines, and electrical generators to be housed. The Titanic carried some of the wealthiest people in the world, as well as hundreds of emigrants from Great Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia, and elsewhere throughout Europe, who were seeking a new life in America and Canada. Although the sinking of the Titanic has inspired many works of non-fiction and fiction alike, in the forms of books and movies, etc., it still remains a rather elusive mark in history. As such, here are 15 photos of the Titanic before it sank. Number 1. Inspection of life jackets. Before the ship took off, a board of trade inspectors examined the life jackets, called life belts at the time, on the Titanic's crew. Despite these inspections, however, the construction of the life belts were said to be flimsy in design and secured only by fabric strings. They were made of canvas and cork, and these vests actually aided in some passengers losing their lives, not saving them, as the name would imply. Due to its faulty design, especially the cork aspect, many of the people who could not board lifeboats were forced to jump into the freezing water, and they were frequently knocked unconscious. However, thanks to the tragedy of the Titanic, although not until after World War II, similar vests were modified and improvements to the materials were made. Knowing all of this about the men's ultimate fates, this picture is definitely extra chilling to look at. Number 2. Lifeboats. Unlike the life belts, which were available for all of the Titanic's passengers and crew members, the number of lifeboats on board were not sufficient. So, perhaps even more ominous than the last, is this picture of the Titanic's lifeboats seen positioned in their davits. Although the lack of an adequate number of boats was not necessarily the fault of the ship's crew, instead, the number of the lifeboats was dictated by the tonnage of the boat, as determined by the Board of Trade. The Titanic actually had more boats than it was originally recommended. It had 20 when it was only required to have 16. But even still, there were not enough boats for more than half of the passengers and workers on the boat. Now, the Board of Trade determines the number of boats per number of passengers and crew members on the boat. Further, lifeboat drills are mandatory, whereas on the day that the Titanic sank, the drills were slipped because of a Sunday church service, which only added to the chaos and confusion when the ship was sinking. Number 3. Exercising equipment. Open only to first-class passengers, there was a gym on the Titanic. Inside of it were rowing machines, exercise bikes, and a mechanical horse saddle for equestrians to use so they wouldn't lose their riding muscles. And as this picture depicts, the female attendees of the gym wore velvet dresses and overcoats, satin gloves, heels, and fancy hats, while the men were similarly dressed up. They were not adorned with the comfy gym clothes we're used to wearing and seeing today. This image is particularly spooky because we now know that such exercise perhaps did not do what physical activity is aimed at doing, extending the life and health of the individuals. But who knows? Maybe these two were of the fateful to survive. especially the woman, because it was reported that 97% of the women in first class survived the sinking, while only 45% of the third class survived. Still, it's probably safe to say that not every person who used the equipment in that gym made it home alive, as it's estimated that 123 first-class passengers perished after the Titanic sank. Number 4. Icy waters. This image shows just how icy and cold the water was after the Titanic sank, as it was captured just days before the disaster occurred. Part of the reason for the chill was due to a high-pressure cold from eastern Canada, and it didn't help matters that the ship sank in the middle of the night. It has been estimated that the water was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Just for some context, fresh water freezes at 32 degrees, while salt water freezes at 28.4 degrees. Suffice it to say, that water was freezing. The water was so cold that people submerged in it were only able to survive around 30 minutes before succumbing to hypothermia, cardiac arrest, or other cold water shock-related issues. Only 44 to 48 people who fell into the water made it out alive, and most of those survivors were pulled up on lifeboats quickly after. Number 5. The captain and the purser. The Titanic's captain Edward J. Smith on the right, and purser Hugh McElroy, who was responsible for the handling of money on the ship, stood aboard the boat to get this photo as it traveled from England to Ireland one day into the ship's voyage, and a few days before it would sink. But Captain Smith, like Dido's song says, went down with his ship. No one knows exactly where he was when the boat struck the iceberg, but one report by First Officer William Murdoch claimed that he appeared on the bridge of the ship moments after, asking what it had hit. "An iceberg, sir," Murdoch replied. But as to how he actually died, there are many theories. Author Wynne Craig Wade, writer of the Titanic, End of a Dream, said that Captain Smith had at least 5 different deaths, from heroic to ignominious. And that statement is true. One story claimed that he gallantly waited to sink with his ship, and another posited that he was simply swept off the boat by a wave. Some even say that he jumped into the water while holding a baby. Either way, before April 15th, Captain Smith had more than 40 years at sea, had rarely been involved in an accident, and was never held accountable for a mishap of any kind. Purser McElroy also passed away, but fortunately for the man who took the photo, however, he got off before it sank when the boat made it to Ireland. Number 6. Children playing on deck. This image serves as a grim reminder that children were also aboard the Titanic. There were more than 100 children in the first, second, and third classes. Children documented on the boat included William Carter, 11, whose 2 dogs were in the ship's kennel, Marjorie Collier, 8, who accidentally left her favorite doll aboard, and Johan Svensson, 14, who was joining his father and older sister in South Dakota from Sweden. For those in the higher classes, there were lots of areas to play on the ship, but for kids in the third class, a lot of it was off limits for them. So, third-class children often had to make their own fun. Johan was said to be in this group, and so was another boy named Frankie Goldsmith, 9, who entertained himself by swinging from cranes in the baggage area. Unfortunately, even though the rules for the limited amount of lifeboats was women and children first, some, mostly from the third class, did not make it. Number 7. Iceberg. This picture wasn't snapped before the Titanic sank, but it was taken before the photographer had heard of the news. Is this the iceberg responsible for the disaster that met the passengers and crew members of the Titanic? It could be. This image was snapped by the steward of a passing ship on the morning after the Titanic sunk. As already mentioned, the people on that boat had not yet heard the news of the sinking, but the man who took the picture said he saw red paint smeared along the base of the large ice formation. Whether the pictured iceberg was the one that the Titanic hit or not, it is not disputed that such an icy mound was the reason it sank. Lookouts apparently spotted it at the last minute in the darkness, but the ship was not able to avoid brushing against it. And as that happened, the iceberg punched holes in the ship's steel plates and flooded 6 compartments. From there, disaster ensued. Number 8. Passengers waiting to board. Here we can see a long line of people waiting to board the Titanic on April 10, 1912. This picture shows you just a snippet of the large number of passengers on the ship as it sank. In total, there were 2,240 passengers and crew members on the ship on April 15, 1912. The ship was actually considerably under capacity because it only had 1,316 passengers instead of its ability to accommodate 2,453. Regardless, of those passengers, 324 were in first class, 285 were in second, and 709 were in third. The distinction of class was based on ticket price and facilities that could be accessed. Unfortunately, little over half of all the people on board did not survive the shipwreck. Number 9. The Olympic. The Titanic was the second and largest of an Olympic-class ocean liner trio, which was run and operated by the White Star Line. Boat classes are typically named after the first boat of their kind, so the first was named the RMS Olympic, which was the Titanic's slightly smaller sister. The two ships can be seen together in this photo. In 1911, around a year before the Titanic sank, the Olympic sustained serious damage after colliding with another ship called the HMS Hawk. After investigating the crash, officials deemed that the Olympic was at fault and required the White Star Line to pay damages. This nearly made the company file for bankruptcy. Some conspiracy theorists believe that one of its owners, J. Bruce Ismay, orchestrated the Titanic's sinking to claim the insurance money that would cover the losses of both the Olympic and the Titanic. Believers of this theory often also believe there was a third ship called the Californian that was planned to sail by and rescue the passengers from drowning. Although alluring, these and other conspiracies are unreliable, and the real reason for the accident was that the ship's speed was expedited to make it to its destination, New York City, faster. In the Senate hearings following the Titanic disaster, survivor Elizabeth Lines came forward and testified that she heard Captain Smith and Ismay talking about the ship's speed and possibly engaging the backup broilers to make a surprise arrival in New York a day earlier than originally planned. Although we already know that the captain did not survive, Ismay was said to have jumped into one of the last lifeboats, although some accounts say he got into the first and made it out of the situation alive. He may have survived, but he was thought to be one of the most hated men on Earth after the Titanic sank. He was seen by many as responsible for the disaster. Fun fact, there was a woman named Violet Jessup who was on board the Olympic when it collided with another ship in 1911, and she survived both the sinking of the Titanic in 1912 and its sister ship, the HMHS Britannic, in 1916. Number 10. J.P. Morgan's room. This picture shows the Green Parlor, which was a room inspired by the Palace of Versailles. It had a reception room, a lounge, a smoking room, reading and writing rooms, a bedroom, and a spacious bathroom. Another owner of the White Star Line, J.P. Morgan, was scheduled to stay in a similarly extravagant room on the Titanic, but he canceled at the very last minute. The cancellation only fueled conspiracies. Some claim that Morgan had motive to sink the ship because 3 people, John Astor, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim, were on board and opposed his idea for a centralized banking system, i.e., the U.S. Federal Reserve. Of course, this theory has been debated for years, and some historians have offered more plausible reasons for his cancellation, such as falling ill, wanting to spend time with his mistress, and wanting to get his riches out of France after the passage of a law about Americans not being able to export art from the country. However, it has been said that no solid documentation mentioned why his trip was called off. Whatever the reason, director James Cameron excavated the Titanic's wreck while conducting research for the movie, and he was able to find the lounge and reception area of the suite that Morgan was supposed to stay in. Apparently, its fireplace featured a large, expensive marble facade and gilded grills, alongside other gold-plated furniture. Number 11. Pool. There was a swimming pool, referred to as a swimming bath, located on the middle deck of the ship. It was 6 feet deep, 30 feet long, and 14 feet wide. By modern standards, this is a relatively small pool to be on a ship. It was filled with salt water. The lower-class adults and children of all classes were forbidden from using it, and as such, it was seen as a luxury. Interestingly, women and men were not allowed to swim in it at the same time, and men were offered times in which they could swim for free, while women were never afforded that option. Female swimmers and males outside of the designated free periods would pay 25 cents per swim. That payment included the purchase of a swimming suit. It's kind of creepy to look at the large body of water on the ship now, because it's likely that the survivors, especially those that were submerged for some time, would find the activity of swimming pretty triggering after the shipwreck. Another fun fact, the Titanic swimming pool is behind one of the watertight bulkheads, so explorers can't access it, but it's theorized to still be in pretty good shape. Number 12. The Titanic's hull. This image shows the construction of the Titanic's hull, aka the main body of the ship. It was made out of thousands of 1-inch thick steel plating and held together by over 3 million rivets. Despite claiming to be virtually unsinkable, after the boat sank and was rediscovered, scientists said that the composition of the steel became extremely brittle when exposed to cold water. This fact, coupled with the damage of 5 watertight compartments, contributed to the disaster of the sinking of the Titanic. Number 3. Sinking entertainment. Some reports indicate that some men and women in the first class continued to be served as the boat was actively sinking. The reason behind this could be because passengers weren't made aware of the dangers that were coming their way. There was no commotion, no panic, and no one seemed to be particularly frightened. First-class passenger Eloise Smith testified during a U.S. Senate hearing on the disaster. But some of the crew members also joined in, including one of the disaster's most unlikely survivors, Charles Joughlin, the chief baker of the Titanic. He reportedly survived because he drank an excessive amount of alcohol. Allegedly, he just simply walked off the boat and gingerly paddled around in the water until a lifeboat came to rescue him. However, his experience is not the norm. In fact, it's generally believed that an intoxicated person would die of hypothermia before a sober person because of the warm feeling that is experienced after chucking a glass down, which is caused by the blood rushing to the surface of the skin, meaning there is less blood around the organs, and that fact increases the risk of dying due to hypothermia. But a Canadian hypothermia expert named Gordon Geisbrecht said that the waters in the North Atlantic were cold enough that night to cause Joughlin's blood vessels to tighten quickly and cancel out the effect of the alcohol. Given all of these facts, how did he survive? According to scientists, he got an awesome, life-saving power of liquid courage. Number 14. First-class food. This image, in conjunction with the next, shows just how differently the amenities available to the first-class and third-class passengers were. What you're seeing right now is the elegant dining hall accessible by those in the first class. On par with the environment, decadent foods were served inside. On April 14th, the Titanic's final day, the first-class breakfast included made-to-order omelets, chops, and steaks. Then lunch, yes lunch, not even dinner, included a buffet of smoked sardines, veal and ham pie, spiced beef, corned ox tongue, galantine of chicken, potted shrimps, and salmon mayonnaise. Dessert was a wide selection of cheese from England and France, including camembert, cheddar, and Stilton. Then, the final dinner included oysters and salmon for starters, followed by filet mignon, sautéed chicken, rack of lamb with mint sauce, sirloin of beef, roast duckling, punch romaine, cold asparagus vinaigrette, and celery. Dessert included a selection of Waldorf pudding, chocolate eclairs, and French ice cream. There were other luxury restaurants aside from the main dining saloon on the ship that were accessible to only first-class passengers, such as the a la carte restaurant, Veranda Cafe, which was tropical-themed, and Parisian Cafe. Number 15. Third-class dining saloon. Third-class passengers were certainly not afforded the same splendor and elegance as those in the first class, and they slept in bunk beds in tiny cabins and ate in an understated dining hall, and this picture shows just that. Despite the plain eating hall, however, the third-class passengers were actually fed pretty well, given the fact that most steerage passengers on other ships were required to bring their own food on board. Instead, those of the third class were treated to meals that were seen as superior to the BYOF on other vessels. But nonetheless, their food was also much less fancy than the meals offered to the first class. For breakfast, they were offered a protein, ham, smoked herring, or eggs, oats, and freshly made bread. Then for lunch, they were served more fresh bread, cabin biscuits, roast beef, and rice soup. The biscuits were often given to lower-class passengers in order to stave off seasickness. Dessert consisted of plum pudding, fruit, and sweet sauce. However, third-class passengers were not offered dinner, as dinner was seen as suitable for only the upper classes. Instead, they were given afternoon tea, which consisted of an assortment of cold meats and cheese with fresh bread and butter. The tea was also served with more cabin biscuits, thin porridge, stewed figs, and rice. Sadly, the afternoon tea on April 14th would be the last meal for 75% of the third-party passengers.